Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, this is exactly the kind of discussion we want to have with Scott County Delivers, where we see a changing demographic. I think, Mr. Chairman, you pointed out in an earlier presentation, by 2040, 28% of our citizens are going to be senior citizens. And so this is a group of folks that are going to talk about their work and hopefully give you some information as you think about planning for that growing demographic going forward. It's kind of discussion that we want to have here. So I'm going to ask folks on the panel to introduce themselves, then ask you folks to introduce yourselves, and then Danielle, are you doing some kind of opening remarks? And then we'll go right to the questions. So with that, I'll ask you to start out, Lisa.
Lisa Kohner, Public Affairs.
Brad Davis, Planning Manager.
Cindy Geist, Property Customer Services Director.
Katie Elleross, Developmental Disabilities.
Jeff Daker, Developmental Disabilities.
Brittany Bussey, Adult Protection.
Shona Biskins with Home and Community Care.
Jody Kieser-Kisting, Assistant Scott County Attorney.
Luke Hennon, County Sheriff.
I'm Danielle Fox, the Adult Services Manager for Health and Human Services. And I get to introduce this great group of people today that work together on a daily basis to care for our most vulnerable citizens, protecting, supporting, and meeting their needs. Today, our focus is primarily on the adult population, but we do have crossover into some services that provide for children as well. But this could be individuals in the community who have a developmental disability, a physical disability, brain injury, or someone who's experiencing a chronic health condition. So this work is done in partnership with law enforcement and our county attorney's office and runs sort of the full gamut of services where we initially will assess for needs and eligibility, provide ongoing case management, and also provide some adult protective services in the event that there is suspected abuse happening. I just wanted to give a couple of highlights to give some context to the discussion here today. And you all have the materials in front of you, so I won't go through those line by line, but just some highlights. I think Scott County has served historically and continues to serve a higher needs population than similar communities. We've learned that continuously from our visits from the Department of Human Services, who look at our services compared to other metro counties, other comparable counties, and statewide. And across the board, we are serving a higher needs population. This group has had to respond fairly quickly to an increase in need for these services. As you saw in the 2040 comp planning, that percentage is increasing and will continue to increase pretty rapidly. We see statistics anywhere from 7 to 9% of our current population are seniors, and that's expected by 2040, as they mentioned, to go up to 28%. So their service needs continue to climb. We have also faced a number of changing requirements, which were mentioned a couple of times today. We've talked about WIOA, the Olmsted Plan, a lot of state and federal requirements that are coming down on these teams to change their practices and pushing Scott County to make some difficult decisions on how we deliver services. Despite that growing need and all of those curveballs that this group continues to get, we are performing very well in most areas of these services. That was identified in a recent audit done by DHS that they do every 3 years. We were sort of nervous coming into this one, actually, because we had all of those new rules coming into play but hadn't yet had the chance to be evaluated and given technical assistance. So we were actually surprised when the state came in and said that there were, of course, a couple of tweaks and improvements that we can make, but overall they were surprised by how well Scott County had implemented person-centered options for folks and providing choices for individuals. So that was very great. We also have historically and continue to provide services at a lower cost than comparable counties. And I think that's the main things. I will let each person introduce themselves again and give some of the highlights that they see in their specific areas. But one note to make in the materials is you'll see on page 5 to 7, there are some community indicators highlighted. Just please reference pages 10 and 11. Those are the updated charts to those measures, which one of them, adult protection investigations, have stayed fairly stable, but our MnChoice's performance has improved pretty substantially. So if you're looking at the charts, pages 10 and 11 are the appropriate ones.
right. I'll just touch briefly on the sheriff's office and our interactions. And this topic, similar to many other topics, touches over a wide variety of different departments in the county. So where we'll see a change in the amount of investigations we have to deal with vulnerable adults, or the individuals we deal with in our jail or the courthouse, or the calls on the street, whether it's medical calls or other instances that need our attention that are become more specialized or more specific as our population ages or changes. Some programs we've done for a while is, for the past 10 years, we've had Project Lifesaver, which is a tracking device that family members can use to help locate wandering family members. So it could be a child with on the autism spectrum, it could be an elderly person with dementia, and anywhere in between. But it's a way for us to be that service provider to give some assistance. So when they walk off, we don't need to provide all these resources to help find them. We can find them very quickly with the tracking software. So we serve about a dozen individuals at a time with that, and throughout the whole county. For anybody in the city or the townships, we provide that service, and that's been about 10 years. And then a new program we're looking at implementing in the future would be the Vitals app. And you may see a lot of talk about it in the news media recently. And a lot of the talk is more of how to use it for mental illness type calls, but it can also be used for other issues going on that helps the police officers interacting or first responders know more about somebody. So it'd be an app on the police officer's phone, as an app on the individual, or a tracking information card on the person's clothing that when we get with certain feed of them, it alerts us with certain information that their caregiver wants us to know, whether it's their contact information, maybe a short video to help them explain something that they may not be remembering, help them get home or help them get safe. So that's something the police chiefs have been discussing as well with Human Services, how to fund a new program like that.
The County Attorney's Office has the pleasure of working with Human Services and the Sheriff's Department and other law enforcement agencies in the county is really a supportive role. We help them in their investigations by giving them advice on ways that we can keep the investigation moving forward. Sometimes we hit a wall in the services that we can offer, and we end up having to step in and file court cases involving guardianship or conservatorship. A lot of times, though, our biggest role is just answering questions, and those come from not only law enforcement, but also Human Services. And some of those questions include data privacy laws. We have to make sure that we are respecting the privacy rights of individuals. And any other question that kind of comes in the door, we are always happy to help with that.
The team that I work with is the MnChoices Assessment Team. It is our responsibility to go out into the community to do face-to-face assessments with individuals to help to determine the level of supports and services someone may need to either return to the community or to stay in the community for as long as possible and as long as that they are safe. We also determine eligibility for the waiver programs, which are the CAT, CADDY, ACEW, the DD programs, and we determine eligibility for individuals who wish to access DD, which is Developmental Disabilities Case Management Services. I was looking at our 2018 statistics, and we're pretty much on the same level of completing assessments that we did last year, except I was only able to pull numbers for you through the end of October to make sure that they were accurate. And you may have seen that this year we have completed initial assessments by 94% on time. DHS says that if we meet the benchmark of 85% that we're in compliance, but my team was able this year to significantly increase how quickly we are getting the assessments done. And that is primarily because 2 years ago, the county board approved 2 new positions for us. We had a backlog that we had to try to catch up with. And then DHS kept rolling out and having expectations that for people where all their assessments were done on paper, we had to now get them into MnChoices. So our priority fell at that point in time to working with individuals who are currently on programs to make sure that they wouldn't lose any of the supports and services that they have. So we're very proud of our team in picking up the pace and getting it done.
Can I interject for a second in that? So we're looking at page 11, the data on page 11, is that right?
You are correct.
And so the 2016, the board approves the positions, and then you're working on like hiring and backlogs and that piece of it. And so are there, like, that's pretty impressive performance. And I'm just wondering if there's anything else you want to say about what contributed to that beyond the staffing, or maybe the staffing was the...
The staffing was the key issue for us, and having the right people on our team makes a huge difference too. They hold each other accountable. They work very well, and they know all the case managers, so they're able to continue to have these smooth collaborative relationships and network where it's needed.
And we can, I think, just highlight the fact that that has not been sort of the similar situation in other metro areas who are trying to staff their MinChoices teams. There's really a huge issue with a lack of staff to fill those positions. So I think we're very thankful that the board approved those 2 positions that we were able to fund through revenue that was generated by the program. But keeping those staff and getting them up to speed quickly, I think was credit to Shona and her teammates. They did an excellent job.
I also think it says a lot for Scott County that people want to work here. Because for each one of our positions, we receive a lot of applications. And the last time I had an open position, we received 122 applications for one position. And while 40 of them didn't meet the minimum quals, employee relations still had to go through and pick out the top 25 candidates for me. And there was just like 1 or 2 points that separated each one of those individuals as they came through.
So pretty highly qualified.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
I have a follow-up question to that. So, reading some of the information you have, these are the people that went through an assessment, and it wasn't determined, these aren't the people who qualified for services. These are just the people of anybody that you did an assessment on.
Correct.
What percentage do you feel of the MinChoices assessments that you've done qualified for services, and what happens to those people who don't meet the threshold to get any help? How are they tracked, and do you feel that at some given point they finally end up in the category because they didn't get any assistance that they?
It's our job also to write a community support plan for the individuals. And so then in our plan, we make recommendations. We don't follow up with them down the road to see if they did follow through on those recommendations. But I can tell you that I did pull some numbers regarding what happened to these people. Well, not happened to them, but of the number of people that we did do initial assessments on, how many of them were actually denied services. And out of the 287 people that we did initial assessments on, 5% were denied access to a program because they failed to follow through, like on their MA application. Some of them require them to be certified disabled, and they never moved forward with that. Some people didn't go through with the testing they needed for us to be able to determine eligibility. And then there were 7% that were denied for other reasons. And some of those other reasons is they were over assets. So they didn't meet any eligibility for our programs. One of them did end up staying in the nursing home. We had screened the individual to see if, what we could do to help get them out, and they had chose just to stay in the facilities. Others, there was 3% did not meet program eligibility at all. And then one of them we had to deny due to an immigration status. And that is because the person was not eligible for medical assistance because of their immigration status, which means is when they came over here, somebody had signed a document stating that they would be financially responsible for this person and to meet all of their needs for a certain number of years. And if those years have not been exhausted since they entered the United States, they are not eligible for medical assistance, which does not make them eligible for our programs that we work with.
And Cindy, I think what you're getting at, and it might be a little bit further answered once we get through the whole lineup here, but are we getting people that come to our door for services that don't meet criteria, and then do we see them later on? Which I think is oftentimes the case, particularly in the area of adult protection, where someone might come in, the situation isn't bad enough for us to do an investigation, but they clearly have some needs, and we're unable to address that because they don't fit the criteria of our current services.
Okay, thank you.
Can we move to adult protection? That was kind of a nice lead-in. So I'm wondering if we can look at page... Yours. Pardon?
Oh, 10?
Yeah.
Page 10,
Yeah.
thank you. So I'm wondering if you can give some idea, that it does a nice job of presenting percentages and on that kind of re-reporting or re-maltreatment. Can you give us an idea about the numbers that you're dealing with?
That's the question I had too.
That's a great question, Chris, and I don't know that I can give you numbers. I could speculate a little bit.
Okay.
I would say for 2018, the current year, and you don't see the data on here yet because we're not finished with that year, but I would say we're going to finish 2018 investigating approximately 135 persons, like vulnerable adults. And of those 138 investigations that we're doing, I would suspect approximately a dozen of those we've seen them before. Does that answer your question?
It does. I just was trying to get some scope about the numbers.
And that has been increasing pretty rapidly. If we look 10 years back, there were some years when we only had 5, 7, 10, 12 investigations total. So to go from that to 135 is a pretty jump.
So the follow-up question to both of you on what you've said, we saw some of them who have about a dozen cases, who are repeat offenders or who have had repeated abuse of some treatment or maltreatment. Do we know what the underlying factors of that abuse is? Is it because of their home situation? Is there some other factor that's causing this reoccurrence of the abuse in the home setting?
I think that's maybe too complicated to answer because every case is so very different.
Okay.
There could be so many factors. It may be that we're investigating self-neglect. This person is not, they're not caring for themselves in a way that you or I might, but they retain the right to make that decision because they have full capacity to make that choice. And so we may substantiate self-neglect and say, yep, you meet the criteria of self-neglect. But because they're able to make that choice, they continue to do so. So we might see them later on for the same reason. Or it could be financial exploitation, and theft has occurred and it's occurring again. There's just a lot of reasons why that could be. But currently we have 3 adult protection investigators on our team. 4 years ago, there was one partial person, and due to the growth that everybody's been talking about, we currently have a team of 3. Just in 2014, as Danielle already said, we investigated 13. There were 13 investigations for the whole year. 4 years later, in 2018, we will be investigating 138. So that's a very significant amount of growth. Granted, 138 is not a huge number, but when you think about the growth that's occurred in such a short period of time, it's pretty significant and something we need to keep a firm eye on. With that staffing capacity, we're able to respond to reports that are coming in for maltreatment, but we're able to do that on a very reactive basis. In the past, we've been able to have more of a proactive role and get involved before something has risen to a level of abuse or maltreatment. And at this time, we're only able to respond once we're receiving a report that something has occurred. We'd love to see that change, but we don't currently have the staffing to do that.
And you said that, we see your numbers have grown dramatically. And is that in line with what other counties are seeing as well? Or is there something that you've done to make it more well-known to others around a vulnerable person to report different things that they see? So I was just curious if this is in line with other metro, or if we're leading the pack and why that may be.
I think, the state of Minnesota has seen an uptick in reports, and one of the reasons is public awareness. In 2015, the Minnesota Adult Abuse Reporting Center came to be. That's the one call center, it's called MARC, where the entire state, you just have to know one phone number in order to make a report. There is a lot of public awareness. on the side of DHS to put that forth. And so it's a lot easier to make a report and people know what number they need to call rather than calling each independent county. So we're seeing an uptick because of that, but also I think we will continue to see a higher level of reporting than other counties because of what we're anticipating the growth of the senior population in Scott County is going to be.
While we're on this slide, the question I have is on the footnote that 2016, 2017 data were not available and was manually calculated. Does that mean that you were working in a system before then that could track this data and now we're in a different database?
So typically we
system?
get this data from the Department of Human Services, and usually they're about a year to a year and a half behind, but now they are even further behind, so we went into our system and pulled comparable data manually based on our outcomes.
And moving forward, will that lag continue or is there efforts to keep it more?
We're not really sure. The Department of Human Services overall is looking at the data points that they identify and how they pull that data. So I think we're unsure of what that will look like in the future. But for us, I think this is valuable to keep an eye on, so we will likely continue to track that.
Be interesting to see what those statistics look like once they report, and are they using different factors than what you have? If they're going to, let's just say that you have 94% in 2015, is it going to be 99% in their eyes? And what would cause that disparity? But anyway.
I wonder, as you talk about just the increase over a short period of time, has that produced resource issues for the Sheriff's Department or for the County Attorney's Office in terms of your role in managing these cases?
As far as resource issues, I can tell you that I think we are definitely working with Human Services more because we have more cases that are coming in on their end, so there are more questions coming in for us. We always seem to be able to connect and brainstorm and get the work done. So I think we're meeting the demand that's there. I will say we have filed more cases in court than we had in the past for guardianships and conservatorships. So that certainly is taking up more assistant county attorney time. So the workload has definitely increased.
And for the sheriff's office, it hasn't increased a ton because the townships aren't as heavily populated. So we've seen an increase, but it's not as comparable as what like Shakopee, Savage, Pearl Lake are seeing for investigations.
Okay, thank you.
As long as we're on the subject of Sheriff's Office, you brought up the issue of vitals.
Yes.
Is this a voluntary subscription type of program?
Yes.
Okay, so we don't have to worry about data privacy issues. They're waiving the right for
Yes.
that.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
gotcha.
If they choose to join it. Yep.
I would just like to piggyback on something Luke said about the Sheriff's Department and time commitment. One thing I've noticed anecdotally is that when we have a court case that we filed, the Sheriff's Department does the transport for it. And sometimes we see that with vulnerable adults, it might take transport longer than it would take for a transport for other types of cases. They do commitment transports and criminal transports as well, but a lot of times vulnerable adults need to be, there's more discussion, and sometimes they need to have repeated explanations about where they're going and why they're going. And so I just see an increase in time with those increased number of cases.
And speaking of increase, I'm just going off of page 1 here, and you started off with this, Danielle, about how Scott County serves a larger number of high-needs individuals, according to NDH, or do you call it DHS? Sorry. What are the criteria that they use, and which are the comparable counties that they put us up against? Because I'm curious, because that's a rather significant disparity in the percentages there. So I'm just kind of plumbing the back of my minds for reasons why that might be.
Yeah, so they go off of a number of different criteria that they set at the state level, and you guys can probably speak to this better than I can. But things like where they're getting assessments, what are their needs that need to be addressed, what services are they needing in order to stay in the community. Our comparable counties are typically counties that are similar in size. They also will sometimes reference our metro county comparables, so it could be something like Carver County, it could be Blue Earth, it could be Sibley. They usually throw in a variety of mix, but it's usually comparable with population numbers and then proximity.
Yeah, we did go from one cohort to another this past waiver review. And we were with some smaller counties in the past, and now this last time they threw us in with a group that has like St. Louis County.
Washington.
Washington, that they're higher populated, and so it's really based on our population as well. So Washington, St. Louis County, Wright County was in the mix, Scott, and there was.
Yeah, we used to be in cohort 3, I believe it was, which Sherburne County was one of our seemingly main comparisons, and now we've jumped to cohort 4, which is Washington is the closest one that I can think of.
Got it. And I'm just assuming, because you alluded to that the criteria are vast and many for this, and I'm assuming that there's some kind of algorithm, for want of a better term, but like certain things are weighted differently. It's not only the number of potential needs, but the complexity of each individual need and the depth of it that grow into this final assessment of what constitutes a high needs individual.
Yeah, from what I recall, the waiver audit that we had, one of the determining areas that they discussed was the amount of waiver dollars spent per person. And we are very high in that area, showing that, which we've seen all along, the increased clientele where they have a dual diagnosis of developmental disability and mental health conditions for the populations that we serve. So that was one of the main ones that I remember seeing.
Also, when we do the assessments, there are certain areas for like activities of daily living and the independent activities of daily living, whether the person has a disability or not, that weighs, it has certain points and weights to it. And then we have to enter all that information into a state system. And so they're able to see, based on our assessment, how that person came out, what the certain weights were and what their needs are. And then they can match that against when they put in a service agreement, because we're opening them up for services, how much we're spending on those individuals.
Can we go to page 13 for a minute? I'm wondering if, as we look at the number of case management cases that are opened, I wonder, there was reference in your materials about some people being served through county case management and also some contracted case management. And I'm wondering if we could talk about, like, what do we know about the quality of service between a person who is served by a county case manager as opposed to a contract case manager?
So I manage the contracted agencies, and this year, one of the things that Jeff and Brittany and I worked on collaboratively was developing a case management survey that kind of was a more apples to apples comparison. So whether someone was served by an internal case manager, or a vendor case management, they got the same survey, which really helps us kind of dig more into that information of what are the concerns that we're hearing, what are the challenges we're hearing, but what are also some of the praises that we're hearing for our contracted vendors. I only took over this position in July, but we've done a lot of really great, wonderful growth, I think, since July. Brittany, I can't take much of the credit, but had initially put together a nice manual for our contracted vendors of kind of the how-tos, when-tos, and we've been able to grow and expand on that since July. They get that every quarter now. And then also we're starting up some quarterly trainings for them to be able to come in to make sure that they're on par with what is DHS's expectation, what is Scott County's expectation for how do you provide good case management services for our most vulnerable population. And that's a relatively new section of our services. In the past, I think it was 2016, we had about 65 cases that were contracted out, and now we have 431. And that we intentionally set out to identify new contracted case management providers for a number of reasons. One was because we were experiencing the significant backlog, so people were waiting new people who needed services were waiting a long time to get into MinChoices for an assessment, and then they were again waiting to get attached to a case manager. So the length of time that they were going without care when they truly needed it was far too long. So we needed to have a solution in place that we could quickly resolve that, but also we wanted to consider choice of the individual who's selecting that service. So by having a choice in the provider, that's giving people more opportunities to make that determination on their own instead of Scott County just assigning them to a case management provider.
I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, because I'm going to ask you to speculate a little. I mean, I know this is statutory, the MinChoices assessment and everything like that. And, you know, intuitively, it seems that this is a good thing for people to take a little bit more investment and control over the decisions that affect their lives. But I'm wondering if the MinChoices program has done an outcome study on whether or not the outcomes have significantly changed for these individuals.
Not really is the answer.
Oh, okay,
I mean,
okay.
I think MinChoices also relatively new.
Okay.
So I think it's hard for us to track that success. I think we are getting all of these new curveballs kind of thrown at us and responding and trying to come up with our own internal outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Those outcomes from a statewide perspective are still in development under most of these
Got it.
services. So I think we hope to see more of that in the future,
Mm-hmm.
but as of right now, we have very little that tells us outcome-based results.
How old is the MinChoices approach program?
The first 3 counties launched in November of 2013.
Oh, so it is very recent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then we launched, I can tell you the date, April 22nd, 2014.
You know that?
Yes, I do know that.
One thing that struck me reading the packet is there's this push to keep people in their home, serve more people in their home, whether they're aging or disabled. Yet at the same time, I saw that some of the things that aren't working is transportation. We don't have a really strong transit system, particularly in the rural areas. And so when I think about this, are we setting ourselves up for some dilemmas if we see an aging population in the county? We're trying to provide services so everyone can stay in their home, scattered throughout the county, yet we don't have transportation systems to serve all parts of the county. It may raise costs to provide sheriffs or EMS services out to the rural parts of the county. Are we thinking about kind of just the overall cost of keeping people in their home rather than having people over time be in more populated areas where there's just more services?
I think even though transportation is a concern or might be a barrier, overall, the cost of keeping someone in their home is significantly less than having them in any type of facility. We've been able to be creative about transportation services, particularly in the past year. When someone's open to a waiver program, we do have some more options for transportation. We can pay service providers outside of SmartLink to transport people. We've also been trialing the use of Uber and Lyft just to tap into another resource to help with transportation. So we're trying to be creative.
Can I just do a quick follow-up? Lisa snuck a question in there before I was ready.
Sorry.
That's okay. The survey that you talked about, because if I were a consumer, if I were a family member, I would want to know that my family member's getting high-quality service, right? So, like, is that survey data something that your team can bring forward a year from now, or when would you have survey
So
results?
surveys were mailed out on November 25th, I believe, or thereabouts. We've asked families and consumers to return them by December 31st, knowing we're probably going to continue to see a trickle in through February 1. From there, we'll start compiling the data. I would assume we will have some good data measures before the end of the first quarter of 2019. And that is something that we have done annually in the past and plan to continue to do annually.
Okay. Thanks, Katie.
Absolutely.
And then I'm just, one other data question. The DHS audit that you were talking about, are there any measures that they're using that make sense for your teams to use as far as tracking outcomes for people that are using your services?
I think so, and we have several of them included in here. For example, The page 15 is the ranking of person-centered practices and assessments. So this was one that came from the state as a new requirement that we had to implement person-centered practices into everything that we do related to our services, right? And they actually came to our visit and said, everybody is going to get performance improvement plans related to all of these measures, and they had a number of them related to person-centered practices. We actually ranked quite high compared to our comparable counties in implementing these prior to, but this is something that helps us identify if there's person-centered practices. They also have numbers that are pulled about people who are earning monthly income. So on page 16, there are benchmarks associated with people who have a disability who are working who make $250 or less, $251 to $599, and then over $600. So that tells us, do we have appropriate employment options available in the community, and are we supporting people doing that? I think there's some newer information around people who are able to be served at home. So yeah, I think some of it is valuable to us, and we definitely take a look at. Those have also, a lot of those were new measures that we saw this year during that review, and we'll continue to monitor every 3 years when they come back.
Yeah, you're on the slide right now, and one of the questions that I had was, you know, compared to statewide, statewide, well, and the other one, in your cohorts, you look at the ones that have no income, and can you talk a little briefly about some of the people, is it the reasons that they have no income is because there's no job, opportunities, there's no job opportunities for them, or is it just the physical person's capabilities why they have little to no income?
Many of the individuals with developmental disabilities, they go through the VRS process with the vocational rehabilitative services starting in high school now. It's much earlier than before, and they get assessed for that. They are determined to be able to work for minimum wage and beyond, or less than minimum wage. What has been found is that many people want to work for more than minimum wage, but the resulting is that many of them aren't able to find jobs because of maybe significant behaviors, maybe an employer, there's really no realistic way that an employer will hire them, so then they're forced to work for less than minimum wage, that type of thing. But yeah, sometimes it has to do with skills and abilities. Sometimes it has to do with the amount of employers available who are willing to have the patience and understand that there is services and supports to help a person work for minimum wage and beyond, which will allow them to increase their income. But it's a complication of factors, that's for sure.
Go ahead.
One of the things I'll say about this particular measure is it talks about the number or the percentage of people who have no income, but what it doesn't identify is the people who would like to. So that would really get us to what sort of employment gaps do we have. I think we know that that's something we would like to see grow in Scott County, but in which particular areas, I think we don't have all of that information available.
I'm not sure who to direct this question to, but there's a piece on page 2 where it's talking about what's working well. And there's a reference to like using natural support systems and engage, I think from an engaging family members or kind of family and friends around people. I wonder if you could talk about how that contributes to the outcomes for the people in your programs.
I think it crosses over waiver programs, so if we're talking about waiver case management or also adult protection, the state of Minnesota is really encouraging family members to be involved. There's a staffing shortage for providing care for people in their home or in facilities, and so they're really trying to highlight getting informal support like family, those natural support systems involved to reduce cost. And because there is a staffing shortage, and so when we're working and trying to coordinate home care services to meet people's assessed needs, we're trying to identify, are there people in your life that can currently help you with that? And in adult protection, also when we're working on safety plans, we're looking at family members first as well.
We've also been pushing that as it's a less restrictive option, right? So I don't have to pay somebody to be my caregiver. I don't have to pay somebody, say, to make decisions on my behalf. But if I have a family member who's supporting me to help make those decisions on my own or to help just inform how I move forward as opposed to a paid caregiver, that's seen as less restrictive.
So just sort of mobilizing those people, like maybe there's some compensation, maybe not, but just mostly mobilizing family. Okay. Okay. Panel? Oh, go ahead.
Just the last question that I have is just because I've dealt with personal situations, many of you know that I have a daughter who most of you have probably dealt with. Not you, Jody. Nor you, Luke. But the rest are hopefully not adult, well, possibly you could have, but anyway. And there's two questions that I have. One of them being, at one time, I was looking for an alternative living quarters for my daughter, and there seemed to be a lack of, and I was ready, actually, first of all, I wanted her in Scott County. I wanted her close to me because she does come home quite frequently. But the second component was if she couldn't be around, because she's a 24/7 care person, is there some place within the metro that are having some housing options for her? And because she is one of those high needs individuals, there was really no openings for her. It was either she was with a group of highly functioning people, which isn't fair to them, and it really isn't fair to her, or she was kind of stuck in this world of no return. And thankfully, we found some solution that worked for her, but it was through multiple iterations, and we've moved her multiple times. And the second thing is so we have this need for support and knowing that there just isn't anything out there for different populations. The second thing I had was I had a staff member who has a person that has some dementia and also needed to be moved, and she couldn't find anything. And I saw her just come into the office and cry, and it was so emotionally hard for her. And I thought, gosh, I'm dealing now with some parents that have some issues as they're aging, and luckily we can keep them in the home, and we provide the support for them. But what about these families that don't? And what do we do about this aging population that we have no room for, and some of these highly needy individuals, or any individuals for that matter, that you all deal with when there are no options out there for them?
And these guys can definitely provide individual examples and further develop. But I think that there are underlying issues with, there's pressures from the state that come down on us to say there are moratoriums around creating any more facility-based levels of care. So there's what's called the adult foster care moratorium, where we can't develop foster care beds. There is really a push from the state to have individualized options. But we struggle with that because we have an overall shortage of housing options that are affordable to people across the board. So whether that's for people with disabilities or seniors, we just have so little of that here. So there are some efforts that we have engaged in around ensuring that new workforce housing builds, for example, have units set aside. It's not very many, it's maybe like 4 units per building. But we can have those units dedicated to serve people with disabilities. But I would say that that's a significant gap in our community. Absolutely.
I think things have improved in that area, though. Back in 2009, when there was the moratorium on corporate foster care development, there wasn't any expansions allowed or any licensed beds to be added to any county at that point. Since then, they've gradually loosened that, though. It started with if a person was in crisis in any way, if they were in a crisis setting, if they were in a psychiatric hospital or some other facility that had them not being able to be served by any other providers because no providers would be able to or were willing to in our county, that we were able to ask for a moratorium exceptions request. Since then, that's even loosened even more. One of my roles as supervisor of the transition and adult unit is as a moratorium liaison for Scott County. And that is anybody who is getting waivered services that wants to reside in our county and is not able to find any other openings in the corporate foster care or family foster care settings in our county, and it's my job to research that to make sure, and they make a person-centered decision that they want to, and they can find a provider to serve them, which is a challenge. And then that provider finds a site to be able to serve them. They can come to me then, and I collect all that information, and if anything is missing, I ensure that it's received, and I submit that to the state, and then we're able to get awarded another licensed foster care bed for that person. So that happens, and it's happened in our county very frequently, where it's usually the more and more persons, the persons with more and more intense needs that are needing those extra beds, which is good, because then the persons that maybe don't have as many needs are able to stay and live in the other homes that are already in our county. So it has loosened a bit. The problem and the difficulty remains having providers willing and skilled enough to serve them in our county due to the significant staffing shortages.
Right.
And I think south of the river, I mean, even more so, staffing shortages that remain, and transportation and other things too. It was part of the discussion that I wanted to talk about too, about in addition to this moratorium exceptions request that is able to be able to happen, is that one of my roles, I think, as the transition and an adult supervisor in the DD unit, is to continue to take a look at ways to develop individualized housing options, and that may be for people to live in their own home as an adult, move out of the family home, not into corporate foster care. There's the expectation that corporate foster care is supposed to be for the most vulnerable and the most need persons. And more, individualized housing is something that we're expected to develop in our county and all counties. And so one of the things that I've continued to try to do is build relationship with providers and you know, keep my eyes and ears open with landlords, and providers are also doing the same to find other opportunities for people with disabilities to live more in their own homes. So sometimes even persons that you may not think could live in their own home are able to with enough services and supports. So you're really left with the most vulnerable living in the corporate foster cares is the push. Unfortunately, it's not always able to happen as much as we'd like, particularly in Scott County. So probably 50%, I mean, it's my guess, of people are forced to move into apartments and homes and rent in other counties. Dakota and Hennepin are two of the big counties. Because of the rental prices in Scott County, they're not able to afford it. So it's one of those things that we'll continue to work on.
All right, I wonder if we could take a couple questions from the audience, and then we'll entertain questions from the board.
Just, I don't know if it's Jeff or who, page 14, the crisis utilization. I'm just kind of curious if one of you can speak to that, because it looks like we've seen a pretty significant increase in that, and if you have any thoughts on what that's about.
I will note, when I started my career, the autism rate for children across the country was 1 in 100. It's closer to 1 in 40, 1 in 50 now. I think with that diagnosis becoming more and more prevalent, this is part of the pattern that we're seeing. Absolutely.
Is that typical for other counties, do you think?
I think that when Jeff and I meet with the other MCCP metro counties, there isn't anybody who's not meeting that budget threshold expectation for the year. I think that it is a growing trend and a growing need as we see the staffing shortage, as we see fewer corporate foster homes being developed. You know, you have parents who are maybe aging out of being able to care for a very high needs, now young adult or a particularly needy child. And so where will this young adult go? And crisis respite is an option while we can develop other sites or develop other options that are safe and healthy for this kiddo.
One thing that DHS did do to try to help this, so I'm hopeful that these numbers hopefully will go down a bit into 2019. You know, optimism, who knows, but DHS did award several different providers in our crisis respite system, 20 beds in the metro area for corporate foster care in the respite setting. So those are the most challenged individuals that aren't able to be served in regular corporate foster care, that really they need to be removed from parents' home or from their own group home temporarily. Now, because of the moratorium and the inability to find providers, as Katie was talking about, those number of days began to creep up. The stay is supposed to be a limit of 45 days. It's supposed to be respite. Unfortunately, that climbed to double, triple of that, sometimes a year. And then the state, through our MCCP committee, it's the Metro Crisis Coordination Program. It's a program that the 7-county metro area of developmental disability supervisors are a part of that meet to discuss this system and these problems. And as a result, I think, of part of our push, 20 beds were awarded to different providers, and the MCCP system that we're in now oversees that. So we hope that lessens that waiting list and also lessens the amount of days that people spend in those places, with the moratorium exceptions request also being involved, so.
And I think this is just a reflection of the shortage of services overall. I mean, if people are, this is the need that we're currently serving, it's not necessarily the full need that we have. So as they reference, there's a wait list, a significant wait list for people who are going to enter into these facilities. So we might have somebody who's sitting in a hospital, for example, that could be served at a crisis residence, but is not. Or we could have somebody who's at home and the situation is getting to a point where it's just really unmanageable and they should be in crisis, but we can't get them there. So this, I think, tells us that we're definitely serving more people, we're serving people with higher needs, but then they stay there longer because there's no less restrictive option that they can go to.
Do we pay for these, or does insurance pay for these beds, or who pays?
So they are paid out of our waiver dollars, which is state and federal funding. But that does impact the amount of dollars that we can then connect to other individuals who are being provided waiver services.
Other audience questions?
First of all, I'd like to just say kudos to all of you for, this has just been, very informational, but we've had so much growth over the last few years as you've highlighted, and you guys have done just a beautiful job with that, and then with all the changes policy level wise, so great job to you. But question when it comes to the providers, so we added in a contracted case management, a second one a few years ago, and obviously labor shortages, as you've highlighted, have been a challenge. Do we see the need to add another one in the short term?
Well, that's a good question there. I think if you look at the data points, I mean, in 2016, we served 98 cases in contracted case management. Today in 2018, we serve 431. There isn't a week that goes by that we're not assigning at least some cases to our contracted case management vendors. I think that the day is absolutely going to come at some point. I know that I had a conversation with our contracted case manager or contracted case management vendor, Thomas Allen, yesterday. They are hiring in anticipation of some growth and some structural change that they're having to best support their team, which then best supports our population. So I'm sure that at some point that is going to be a further discussion. I don't know that I would say it is in this moment today. But as we see our populations continue to grow that we serve, I would anticipate that would be something we'll have to continue to review and look at.
And one of the things that we're working on, as you talked about earlier, is setting up that infrastructure so that we can support additional providers coming in. I think right now, we used to have one, now we have two. In putting some of those things in place, like a consumer satisfaction survey and other accountability measures, we can manage additional providers coming into that. I mean, some of the bigger counties have 20, 40, 50 plus providers. And so I think we maybe will never get there, but we want to be able to have things in place to make sure people are still getting quality services no matter where they land.
All right. I'd like to give it back to the chairman.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation. Any questions or comments from the board?
Sure.
Ms. Brecky.
I'll see if you have any thoughts on this. I thank you for all the work you do. I also have a personal connection. I have a brother served by several of you who's a high needs individual. I wonder if you see tension between, like when I look at our reports about how much levy dollars is spent on different programs and how much we have, a lot of these programs are funded by state and federal funding, mandated, all that. As we work to maybe help some of our highest users develop more creative alternatives, things like that, are we putting ourselves in a situation where we're maybe saving state that money, but we're costing the county more money, all in good work? We're doing good jobs. Is there any tension there between that state and federal funding and the levy dollars as we try and be creative and help folks live better?
I think there's always tension because overall there's not enough resources to meet the need, right? So we got additional state and federal funding when the state had to take a look at how that was being spent. So several years ago, you may have seen in the media that there was underspending of $100 million of waiver funds, and they saw all this unmet need. People were sitting on waiting lists for services, but we had these dollars across the state that we weren't spending. They've sort of put the pressure on that we need to spend the money that we have, and we need to spend that within a certain percent. So I think ours is, we have to be within 3% of spending for our waiver dollars. But what that did was reallocate resources to communities that had a bigger need. So Scott County usually spent all of our money, or close to, because we had a lot of people who needed the services. Some communities had a significant amount of underspending. So we've actually received a big chunk of dollars that's been reallocated to us from other communities that didn't need it. So that's helped bring additional resources to us. But I think what we continue to focus on are what are the gaps. So the things that aren't funded by state and federal dollars, like adult protection, for example. There's little funding that goes into provide those services, which then puts additional pressure on the county because it's a mandated service and there's certainly a significant need there. But I don't know that I think we have a lot of work to do as far as developing those innovative projects. We've sort of just been reacting to those new requirements that have been thrown at us. And I think have come up with some ideas and have put some of that structure in place. But I think mainly we do essentially get the pressure of the gaps.
Right. And I think that's where maybe as a board we can be more helpful if you really identify some of those, or maybe some policy work we can do that in the end, because it's all taxpayer money and it's all good people, we want to have better lives. If we need to move some of those pots or influence state or federal policy to make us better able to do that, I see that in the upcoming years as we look for those creative options, as we maybe help some of those highest users transform and grow and develop into different situations or different opportunities. So that's something I'm interested in.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.